Perfect. Well, Dr. Redlener, let's get started. So everyone, welcome to Third Floor Views, a production of Chesapeake Family Life, where we talk about health, education, and living with kids. I'm your host, Janet Jefferson. Today, we are talking with Dr. Irwin Redlener about his book, The Future of Us, What the Dreams of Children Mean for 21st Century America, and his new preface and afterward addressing COVID-19. Author Irwin Redlener, MD, is a pediatrician and the founding director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia University's Earth Institute. And that works to understand and improve the nation's capacity to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. He's a public health analyst for NBC and MSNBC, and recently partnered with SHARE in SHARE Cares, which is a new program that assists communities struggling with COVID. Dr. Redlener also is president emeritus and co-founder of the Children's Health Fund with singer-songwriter Paul Simon and Karen Redlener to develop healthcare programs in 25 of the nation's most medically underserved urban and rural communities. He currently serves as a special advisor on emergency preparedness to New York Mayor Bill de Blasio. And I could go on and on and on. So thank you so much, Dr. Redlener, for being here today. To our viewers, if you have any questions or comments, just throw them in the comment section and I will get to as many of those as we can. Let's get started. So first, I really want to start with your book. So originally you wrote this book and it was published in 2017. So I wanted to talk about what the book is about and really why you are revisiting it now.
Well, thanks, Janet. I really appreciate being with you. And so in 2017, I wrote a book that was really based on my several decades of experience working with children who come from lots of adversity and disadvantage. And, this is something I've been concerned about since the beginning of my career, which is that there are so many children, even here in the US, that are missing out on the opportunities that should really be available to all children. And it's such a waste of human potential and such a tragedy for these children who have big aspirations and dreams that all of you would recognize as very similar to what your own children say they want to do when they grow up and what they want to be. But we have a lot of kids who tell me things like everything, and this is in the book, I want to be a paleontologist, I want to be a marine biologist. And I'm looking at these kids and the conditions that they're living in and the education that they're not actually getting, and heartbroken that they won't really be able to get there for the most part. There will be exceptions, and people do rise up out of terrible adversity and are successful. But so many of our children who live in poverty, especially if they're coming from Black and brown communities, that it's like I said, it just kind of tears at you that why shouldn't this kid be able to become a paleontologist? And this was the first story in the book about this kid named William, who I saw in the back of one of our mobile clinics a number of years ago. A really impoverished kid. He was in a foster facility. His family had been homeless, and he was there, poor, not getting to school. And I said, and when he told me he wanted to be a paleontologist, I said, what is that? And he told me it's about looking for dinosaur bones. I said, well, how do you know about that? And he pulls out of his pocket a yellowed article from the New York Times from a year before somebody had given him about a paleontologist out west. And this was his lifeline. This was, he was hoping to kind of somehow get there. He had so much going against him. This is why I put that as the first story in the book, because it was so impactful to me and emblematic of what so many of the children are going through. So that was the motivation for the first book when it first was published in 2017, that to talk about the interrupted aspirations and dreams of too many children and what that meant for these kids, but also for the country, how we really could not afford to have so many children with unfulfilled aspirations growing up that are going to need remediation and all sorts of things that, like water waste. Mm-hmm. I updated it and it came out in a paperback in October, because on top of everything else, now we have this pandemic which is putting us and those children even farther behind. And now it's not just for children living in poverty. This is for all of us. All of our children are experiencing issues and challenges, as are all of us parents and grandparents, of what do we do? Our kids, many of our kids have not been going to school for a long time. Some kids are okay with remote learning, some are not. Will many more children than we ever expected be set back in their education? How do parents talk to their kids about what's going on? And now complicated by horrible social and political upheaval. This is a rough period of time for all of our children. And that's why I updated the original book.
Yeah, it seems so timely. And now with everything that's going on, it makes so much sense to tie it back to the moment. So it clearly is such an important story to tell. And it's such an uplifting story to think about the innocence and the potential that all children have, with their hopes and dreams. But what does it say about us as a society that this is a story that we need to tell, that there is such a discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots?
Well, this is a chronic problem. My first job as a pediatrician was running a community health clinic in East Arkansas, which at that time was the sixth poorest county in the United States. It was Lee County, Arkansas. And, I as a young, pediatrician, just freshly minted out of my training program, I had come from Brooklyn. I had responded to an actual poster trying to recruit doctors to come to Lee County. In fact, Janet, it's on my wall over here. Let's just see if
No
I don't know whether
way.
you can see that, but
Yes.
those are the first one on the left is the poster that attracted me. I actually took it off the bulletin board, said, "Serve America, doctors needed," and then get some statistics about Lee County, Arkansas. I was training in the University of Colorado Medical Center. I
Right.
come from Brooklyn, and where was Arkansas again? And we got out the maps and found it. And then the one, two over was the poster that I developed to recruit doctors to the center. But
you
yeah.
weren't on track to go to a small rural clinic. You were supposed to be training to be a pediatric cardiologist, right?
Exactly.
So this was like a sharp turn.
Literally, this was in the doctor's dining room. I'm carrying my tray and whatever I had for lunch, and I stop at the bulletin board, and I see this poster, and literally the next day I called the number on the poster, and then the weekend after that I went out to visit the place. I was awestruck. It was unbelievable. And my predecessor there was this incredible doctor named Robbie Wolf, who showed me what was going on, the challenges they were facing. And I met a lot of people there, and I had to come back to Colorado, to Denver, and tell the director of the pediatric cardiology program that, and this was like in the spring, "Sorry, I won't be able to take that job you offered me as a fellow in pediatric cardiology. It was supposed to start in July." And it was, awkward to say the least. But I had the most extraordinary couple of years. I loved it there, and really loved the patients I work with. I would do house calls every night. I got to know a lot of these families. It was very personally uplifting and gratifying. And I met Karen. She was a 21-year-old Vista volunteer there, and she's now my wife of many, many years. But so it was a multi-function impact on it's like affecting my personal life, my personal aspirations for what I want to do in my career, and immersed me in a hardcore challenge that I was very up for then, and this continued for the rest of my career. This wanting to pay attention to children who were behind the eight ball, who weren't getting what any American child should expect. And that became, a life mission. But the Arkansas experience was life-changing for me, and, an indelible impact on where I was going in the trajectory going forward.
And that's what paved the way also to a lot of your activism. And, in your book, you talk about, you're a doctor first and trying to get to patients, but then there were challenges as in physically not able to get to them because the roads were so bad. And then if you could just talk a little bit about that experience on what was it like to live in Lee County,
Yeah.
and also the sort of political challenges that were going on, and why that prompted you to become the activist you are today.
Right. So the summer I went there, there was a lot of violence. Like a couple of weeks after I got there, there was a curfew imposed on the town, which, it was about 20% whites, 80% black people. And all the political infrastructure was controlled by the white population. And there was a tremendous amount of racism. They were just taking down the whites only waiting room signs in doctors' offices and on drinking fountains. And some young African American woman was insulted racially in the end of July of 1971. And she was threatened, and the sheriff came and arrested this 14-year-old because she walked out of that little pizza joint and didn't take or pay for the pizza she ordered. So they arrested her for breach of contract. And so that set off a bunch of violence and social unrest. And it was just absolutely crazy. And the reason as you mentioned, that I couldn't get to do my house calls, and this was stunning to me. What did I know? I was going to make a house call, see a sick patient, and the roads would be completely muddy and impassable. Why is that? The roads were never paved or graveled going out to homes where black families lived on all these old plantation shacks. And it was horrific. And why didn't they get paved or graveled? It's because the white principal government official got to decide which roads would get paved and which wouldn't. And I found this so unacceptable. It was like what you were just saying. This was more than I felt like tolerating. And so I started doing a lot of advocacy in addition to pediatrics there. And one of the things was, I would go into Baptist fundamentalist black churches around the county and talk about the time for change. And it was interesting. I was getting pushback from black clergy who were telling their congregation, it's everything will be okay in the afterlife. And my point was, that's good, but it also could be a hell of a lot better here in this life, like right now. But we had to get a different leadership politically in the county. So they'd gravel the roads, and then I would be able to make the house calls that I needed to make. And that resonated. And the guy I was working for, this extraordinary community leader named Ollie Neal, and I, we're running around being advocates, in a hardcore place. And I was intoxicated by that ability to enhance what I could do medically by what I could do also politically. And this has been an ongoing theme in my life, where we do a lot of clinical work, but two things changed for me. One is that it wasn't so much I was only focused on healthcare for children. I really came to realize that it's not just healthcare, it's the success of children, which meant healthcare and education and living conditions and so on. And secondly, if I was going to make changes beyond the patients that actually came in contact with me, that I have to figure out ways to impact the conditions so that many more children will benefit from what I was able to do than just the ones I could see in my office and check for ear infections. So that was a long evolution, and ended up in me feeling, when we created the Children's Health Fund and we were hiring doctors, I said, you're doctor advocates. You're not just doctors. And we wanted all of them to appreciate, and we now have 25 programs around the country, and they all feel like they're involved in something bigger and grander than doing the healthcare, but also focusing on the success of children and advocacy for the changes that need to be made.
Could you talk to us a little bit about the Children's Health Fund and how that initially started? And I know that, Paul Simon is one of the founders as well, and like how that relationship
Yeah.
started, especially I love that your career is so incredible, and then it's peppered with these celebrities, these singer-songwriters.
It's so
It's
weird. And
fascinating.
I was actually spoiled as a 28-year-old doc in Arkansas because the clinic was being defunded by the Nixon administration. And I randomly called the manager because his name was listed in a Sunday supplement of the Arkansas Gazette of this iconic folk singer named Joan Baez, who started really the American folk music scene. She was the one who found Bob Dylan, ultimately had a long relationship with him. But so I wrote to him randomly, and 2 weeks later I got a call in the clinic, and the nurse says, you got somebody named Joan on the phone. I forgot I even written to the guy. Oh, hi, this is Joan Baez. I said, no, you're not. She said, no, this is Joan Baez. I was fainted. Anyway, long story short, I told her, I actually sent her manager these photographs of children sleeping on these bare box spring mattresses in abysmal, visible poverty. And she said, I'd like to help you. And long story short, she came to Arkansas and did a benefit concert. She came several times. The first time was just he spent a weekend with one of these totally impoverished families in this shack on an old plantation. And it was, made an incredible impression on her. She did a benefit concert, saved the clinic that I was running. So I thought, wow, this is easy. Just call an A-lister iconic singer. Of course they'll come up, which, there's much more to it than that. But anyway, we're still friends with Jonah, and I speak to her quite regularly. But I had an interlude in my career. Why? Do you remember there's probably a lot of your listeners and viewers who don't remember "We Are the World," this incredible song by Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie. And it was part of an organization called USA for Africa. Mm-hmm. And that one record in 1985 raised $65 million, an extraordinary sum then. But I was helping advise them, and I was on the board of USA for Africa. Mm-hmm. And I was their medical director and director of grants. And long story short is Paul Simon was one of the singers on that extraordinary production. And he wanted to use some money to help, some of the money raised to help homelessness in New York, which was on the serious rise in the late 1980s. And he asked the organization, could he use money that was raised from We Are the World? They said, no, but Dr. Redlener's in New York. Why don't you connect with him, which we did. And I took him on a tour of welfare hotels and homeless shelters in New York City, homeless shelters for families. It was incredible. And I'd been in a lot of places with a lot of poverty, but walking into those homeless shelters in New York City in 1986, at that point, it knocked me for a loop. And Paul was like completely stunned. He'd never seen anything like that. And so he said, what could we do? And I said, well, I'm a pediatrician. So I'd like to enhance healthcare for these homeless children. And why don't we do it I'll set up a mobile clinic. We'll design it. And actually, Karen Redlener designed the mobile unit. Paul tried to raise the money from his colleagues and Bruce Springsteen and a bunch of other, Billy Joel. I was in his office when he called a couple of them. They had no idea what he was talking about. So he said, you know what, I'll just fund this myself. Oh my God. So a year later, 1987, we had our first custom design mobile pediatric clinic, fully self-contained clinic on wheels. I was the pediatrician. And we used it. It was mobile, so we could go to multiple hotels and shelters. And that's how it started. And we gradually raised money, and we replicated it in all these places around the country. And, Paul and I and Karen and his wife were close friends. And it was a hell of an experience. But, off the walls, I figured when I was writing the book, that this was so unusual that people might be at least entertained by this among the other stories about children suffering and all that. Anyway, so that's why I included those stories. And it's been many more. Mark Anthony and I became friends, and we actually he raised a fair amount of money to do Hurricane Maria relief in 2017, and he asked me to distribute the money. We developed a bunch of programs in Puerto Rico to help on the recovery from Hurricane Maria, and now the share thing with the pandemic. So, this is one of the elements that's added a little spice to my own life, and it's pretty interesting, but
I love it. So you have experienced this long career of activism and really being in the trenches and seeing how this is impacting children. And with all of that, you've seen a lot of political turmoil, and you've talked about disasters. I was just wondering if you could reflect on your career and your experience a little bit, and apply that to 2020, both in terms of the racial justice movement that's going on right now, but also the racial violence and the political upheaval, and then of course the pandemic. We are in this moment of great change. Thinking about all that you've seen throughout your entire life, like what do you think of this moment now? Are you filled with hope? Are you worried?
well,
How do you reflect on it?
this is, Janet, an incredible moment as you just reflected upon yourself. For me, if you think about all the since 1971 was my first job in Arkansas. So if you think about all the presidents we've had since that moment, and the mix in Congress, sometimes we've had two parties controlling both houses of Congress. Sometimes it's split. But through all these presidencies and all these different politically made up Congresses, the problems have never fully been resolved. Even when my favorite Democratic candidate became president, so the child poverty rates have gone up and down, but varying in a very small range, no matter who was in office, no matter what mix of Republican and Democrat was there. And I think this took a long time to sink into me. It's unimaginable to me. When I got to Arkansas in 71, I was really a child of the Kennedy and Johnson eras. And I was telling people, that Kennedy sent somebody, manned space astronauts to the moon and back, and there was progress being made in civil rights. And I was of the mindset then that we could solve big problems. And I would tell people, and I put this in the book also, that 10 years, 15 years max, we have solved child poverty. We'd have ended racism in America, which started, in the 1600s. But whatever, we'll fix this. And here I am, like a half a century later, and I'm looking at you, and I'm thinking of the legacy that my generation is leaving for your generation and my own children. And I find this really some combination of disturbing and strange, that my own personal dreams and many of my pals who've been involved in social issues and activism, who are, disappearing from the scene one way or the other, are very frustrated that we haven't been able to make more progress. So now we have a moment in history, really, where somebody like Donald Trump becomes president. I hope I'm not being too political for your audience, but this has been a nightmare. So for everything that I thought should be the values and the clear mission of America have been undermined by Donald Trump, starting with that Access Hollywood tape, these unbelievable things he said about women, gets elected president. And now we have setbacks in everything, and an exacerbation of the racism that's been a problem for a long, long time. And by the way, it pre-existed him, obviously, but he made things so much worse. Mm-hmm. And then we have, the pot boils over, and we have the demonstrations around race and all that we've seen after, a number of police killings of Black men in particular, but not exclusively even men, but a horrible time. And then on top of that, the pandemic comes, and it's like, oh, this can't be. Don't we already have enough stuff to worry about? And apparently not, because we get this horrific pandemic. And now, just in the last 10 days, this attack on our Capitol So I'm looking at this and saying, this is an unbelievable moment, and hopefully Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will be able to address a lot of these issues, but it's not going to be easy at all. We have things that have been unleashed in America that are deeply troubling. So then you focus in on a family. They are watching all this unfold. Many people feeling really disempowered to do really anything all that much about it, except they did vote for Biden, which is a great thing. But like, now what? And what happens around the dinner tables when we're sitting there talking to our kids? They just saw the news. Unfortunately, I'm sure there's a lot of at least middle schoolers and older that watched incomprehensibly seeing this attack on the Capitol unfold and are asking questions, or if they're not asking questions, they're thinking the questions. Mm-hmm. So what are parents supposed to do, and how do you, first of all, personally understand what's happening and absorb it, and then how do you talk to your kids about it? And I think this is going to be a challenge that's going to be with us for some time. Mm-hmm. That parents are going to have to be facing, not to mention the fact that they're worried about the interruption in schooling for their children, the psychological impact, and for low-income families who do not have necessarily the capacity to function remotely in school because they may not have the hardware, there's millions of people around the country don't have broadband, and they may not have mentors at home that can help them deal with this. And even if you do have the things that you need, the tools, it's extremely difficult. Do parents stay home and not work so they can help their kids function in school? I mean, there's question after question, and none of us feel that great either. The ultra rich have gotten oddly richer in this last 8 or 9 months, which is extraordinary. But for most of us, this has been a struggle economically, psychologically, socially. I mean, we're really at what they say is an inflection point. I don't know exactly what that means, but it's something that's happening. What does that mean? No, I know. But right. So that's where we are, a moment in time. And that's why I updated the book and put it out in paperback.
So something that you've talked about in your work is resilience, and how many children are naturally resilient, though some kids are certainly more resilient than others. In this trying time, what advice do you have for parents to promote resiliency, to foster it, to teach it? What role can parents play, and what advice would you have to give to parents to help move that in a positive direction?
So a great and very pertinent question. So let's start off with this fact. Some of us are born more resilient than others. There are some, inherent genetic issues which help determine personalities and how people function. And there's some children, and some adults for that matter, who could put up with a lot. I did a lot of work after Hurricane Katrina in the Gulf in 2005. And a lot of families who were displaced and lived in horrendous conditions for 6 months to 18 months. A lot of parents were very resilient. Like, they could handle it. They could handle their kids and so on. They could handle moving to Houston and so on from Louisiana. But over time, somebody who is very strong and resilient, there's a limit to how much of uncertainty, dislocation, and loss of your jobs and homes and everything that you can tolerate. If you don't get recovery at some point, the resiliency tapers off. Mm-hmm. Some people were in bad shape from day one. Other people were able to tolerate a much longer period. So there's that individual variation. But there are things that parents can do to enhance resiliency among their children, no matter how resilient they were or were not to begin with. And those have to do with, first of all, reinforcing the bond between yourself and your child. So when kids are going through a traumatic experience, the more they feel protected by a caring parent who seems to have control of the situation the better. And of course, what parents do is extremely dependent on how old their children are, what stage of development they are, how sensitive they are, and so on. But one of the things that's always recommended is during a crisis, like the pandemic, like watching what's going on in television, sustaining the family routines. So things seem as normal as possible. We always eat dinner at 6:30 or whatever it might be. We have a bedtime routine. All of those things are particularly important during a crisis. Secondly is the physical expression of affection. So, and sometimes this happens without conversation. So you're sitting on the couch and you're reading a story and the kid's sitting right next to you and your arms around he or she, him or her. Those are important symbols that I got, mom and dad have my back. And that's really important. And sometimes it's very hard because the parents themselves feel discombobulated and unable to tolerate another hour of what's around them. But the parents being strong, and persisting with the normal family routines and a little more expression of affection for kids is very important, helping them. And like I was saying, this depends a lot on the age. And some, for younger children, we want to actually keep them as distant as possible from watching television.
Mm-hmm.
It's like for a 4-year-old to be watching, people crashing through the windows of the Capitol, not a good idea. It was like, 9/11, they kept looping these television clips of airplanes crashing into buildings. A young child has no way of determining whether they don't know whether it's the same clip being run again or this keep happening. So keeping children away from TV, the routines, the affection, and so on, and also being on the lookout for things that may indicate unspoken anxieties that a child may be having. And that this has to do with things like behavioral changes. Children are more angry or acting out violently, or who are even more quiet, sleep disruption. All of these things may be a sign, even if something's not spoken by your child, that something is wrong, it's troubling them. So being alert for those triggers, that there may be something going on, is important. And by the way, to handle that, sometimes parents talking to the kids and talking through and what's going on, if the child's able to express herself or himself, that would be good. Sometimes, it's very difficult for the parent to handle, and the first stop might be the pediatrician.
Mm-hmm.
This is what's happening and I'm concerned. Bedwetting is returned.
Right.
The child's very angry. Child won't talk to me or others as much as he or she used to. And then see what the pediatrician can do as a first line. And it may be somebody else that you trust that's good, like could be a clergy person or a friend, an uncle, whatever it might be. And then finally, there are some children who actually will need professional psychological help, and parents should not wait too long. If you're noticing something and it's not easily addressable, go to the next step, because we don't want new behaviors based on anxiety or fear or whatever to become ingrained, so they become even more difficult to deal with. So understanding the progression of where you can get help is really important. So those are the kind of things that we would like parents to be aware of.
That's all really helpful, really tangible, clear things in terms of, extra love and maintain a routine, and then look for abnormalities, look for changes, negative changes in behavior, and act fast. So that's all really helpful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Redlener, for joining us today. And thank you for speaking a little bit about the future of us, what dreams of children mean for 21st century America. And to our viewers, make sure you check it out. It's an incredible book. It's a really interesting and fun read. We're going to put a link up on our site so you can just click right to it. Thank you also to all our viewers and listeners for being here today. Visit ChesapeakeFamily.com for all your up-to-date local information on health, living, and school for today's Maryland parent. This episode will be archived on ChesapeakeFamily.com in podcast and video format. I'm Janet Jefferson with Chesapeake Family Life and Third Floor Views. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Janet.